Welcome, everybody. We are here today to interview Professor Hiroshi Fukurai, a co-founder of OPRAC and a professor of Sociology and Legal Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Professor Hiroshi Fukurai, thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Thank you for being here today.
You're welcome. First of all, I thank Professor Dennis de Castro-Harris for creating this wonderful opportunity to talk about my most recent research on the understanding of the role of international law, called the Original Nation Approaches to International Law, which can be abbreviated as ONAIL, as well as my work on so-called the Original Nation Scholarship.
Thank you, Professor Hiroshi. Please, what is ONAIL? If you can try to summarize for us.
Okay. The idea is to look at the international relations that exist today, right? From the perspective of indigenous and original nation and peoples. Therefore, offering not the state-centric narratives of international relations as well as the role of international law, rather the diametrically opposed, what I call on-the-ground portraits of the relationship that exists between original nation and the state system. In doing so, the Original Nation Scholarship tries to capture the long-standing regional conflicts and armed struggles and resistance that exist today, as well as conflicts that existed for the last several hundred years all across the globe. And these conflicts reflect the historically rooted tension and conflicts between two geopolitical entities, the state on one side and the original indigenous nation on the other.
So it seems to me that you are trying to create new concepts of nation, perhaps criticize existing concepts of state as well. Is that so?
Yes. So I'm looking at these regional conflicts that existed for the last 200-300 years from the perspective of the two geopolitical tensions that between the state on one hand and nation on the other. And let me define what the state means, as well as what the nation is about, so that it clearly delineate my approach from the perspective of the on-the-ground resistance and oppositions against the state encroachment, against the original nation's ancestral homelands and territories. So let me define what the state is. The state is rather a recent invented geopolitical entity. It is almost the outgrowth of the European kingdoms and decentralized power of Europe that had exported its colonial and imperial projects in creating their colonial compartments all across the globe. And since the colonial movements in the 20th century, and these European colonies in Africa, Asia, and the rest of the world became the independent states, right? So this concept of a state, or even the notion of state sovereignty, and that is the geopolitical entity, came out originally from the 1648 peace treaty in Westphalia, which is today's German city, to recognize almost 350 years ago the sovereignty of the newly emerged state like Austria, Sweden, United Kingdoms of Netherlands, and other regional kingdoms, feudal powers, as independent and sovereign state entity with no intervention principle. And so this geopolitical entity with state delineated borders had been extended into colonial domains in other countries and in other continents and areas. These European colonies then gained independence throughout the decolonization periods of the 20th century, including nearly all of today's so-called post-colonial African countries, Asian countries, among many others, because the state was created by violence and force. The state remains necessary geopolitical domain bound by law. That is, the state remains what I call legal construction. On the other hand, nation is quite different. It's a community of people who have common historical understanding of their psychological bonds, histories, traditions, language, and memory that were strongly attached to ancestral homeland and ancestral space. Their social, political, and economic life has been largely based on the self-sustaining culture and the tradition of self-governance. And the nation has long existed before the advent of the state system, which for the last several hundred years unilaterally imposed itself upon unconsenting and recalcitrant nations and peoples. For example, I live in the city of Santa Cruz, where the University of California was built, and this is where I teach. Until 150 years ago, Awaswas people, that's Ama Musun tribe of so-called larger Ohlone, original nation, which lived in the Bay Area, including the San Francisco and Monterey region, for more than 12,000 years. They have been eradicated politically and militarily by the settler populations who had imposed so-called settler state colonialism upon the original nation and peoples in Northern California. So let me give you one specific example of the eradication of original people in Santa Cruz. First governor of California, Peter Burnett, issued one of the earliest executive orders in 1851 to exterminate the California Indians by putting the bounty on every Indian body and soul. The California government eventually paid $1.2 million to bounty hunters, including settlers and soldiers who participated in the military excursion to exterminate the California Indians. So for the last few hundred years, state has engaged in the simultaneous process of what I call state building project and nation destroying project. The similar state initiated predatory and destructive project had been going on, not just in California, but the rest of North America and all across the rest of the world. And that's what the ONAIL, original nation approaches to international law, tries to elucidate in today's society.
Very good, very good. It seems very clear, but it seems to me then that somehow you're making also some kind of criticism toward the usage of the expression United Nations, no? Because in fact, they are not really nations. We are talking about United States. Isn't that so?
Yes, because if you look at the root of international law, Jeremy Bentham and many other scholars came out with this concept about 200 to 250 years ago. They talk about the legal binding documents and arrangements and agreements between states. So in other words, it is not the international law that doesn't bind the relation between nations, which we talked about, the original nation, indigenous nations. So international law is a misnomer. So it should have been called interstate law. So another way of saying, United Nations, if you look at the membership, as of today, it has 193 member states. Okay, they are not member nations. So it's a United Nations should be called United States. But unfortunately, the nomenclature had been taken elsewhere. But again, the names such as international corporations, international agreement, it should have been called interstate relationship, interstate, trans-state corporations, and so on. So there have been collusion of the state on one hand, and also concept of nation on the other.
Very good. Yes. But how does it differ? How does ONAIL differ from other theories of international law? For example, nowadays we have a very prominent approach called the third world international approach to international law. How does ONAIL differ from TWAIL?
Very good. So you mentioned the TWAIL, that's a third world approaches to international law. They came out and became prominent after the workshops at the Harvard and at the prominent law schools in the United States and beyond, by the way. They had numerous workshops and tremendous conferences and so on. So third world approaches to international law, which came out as being prominent today, is an innovative and dynamic socio-legal analytic framework, and largely developed and debated and advanced by critical scholars in the developing third world countries and peripheral or semi-peripheral countries in the global south, as well as progressive socio-legal scholars who had been concerned with the growing disparity and increasing polarization of political power, economic inequality, and inequities, especially in human rights violation, as well as protection in the third world. And their theoretical approach had been, unfortunately, from my perspective, very canonical in terms of its being too state-centric. That is, using the state as a principal unit of geopolitical analysis. And it has to be de-integrated at the even national level, a sub-state level. And their focus has been exclusively on socio-economic and political and cultural dimensions of the third world. So if you look at the original nation approaches to international law, advanced that human atrocities, even today's ecological destruction and devastation, have also been taking place in the homeland of the original nation, not only in the first world, but also in the third world, as well as non-state geopolitical autonomous regions all around the globe. So, say, transnational corporate culture to monopolize the nature and the humans to raw materials for plunder, profit, and control, which TWAIL had criticized, but has refused to recognize legally protected state borders or interstate boundaries. So many original nations, not only in the third world, but also the first and second socialist even states, had been victimized, their resources being usurped, and their ecological diversity had been destroyed. So simply by focusing on the third world and from state-centric perspective is not sufficient. And let me give you one example on this. I live in the United States and I teach indigenous studies. And in the Lakota Nation that exists in South Dakota, and perhaps one of the most impoverished original nations in the US in North America, century-old state corporate ravages of indigenous territories, including its sacred homeland of the Black Hills, had led to the extraction of gold since 1876 without interruption. The industrial extraction of gold, silver, lead, zinc, tungsten, and other minerals has led to the massive contamination of and the pollution of fertile soils and fresh water in large territories with high concentration of arsenic, mercury, and other pollutants, all of which have been manifested in significant health and socioeconomic inequities in the indigenous communities. So today, if you look at the Lakota Nation and the people, Lakota peoples have the US's lowest life expectancy of 44 years among men, a high tuberculosis rate, which is 800% above the US average, and more than 90% of adults with alcoholism, unemployment rate of more than 85%, and 90% of Lakota people living below the poverty line. They declared independence and tried to secede from the US in 2007, following the adoption of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and tried to be recognized as a sovereign nation in the international community, even though no state came out as the entity that recognized the independence and the sovereignty of Lakota nation yet, but it could happen. So another way of saying, the struggle of the original nation, not only in Lakota nation, but all other indigenous original nations, okay, to right to self-determination continue today. So original nation scholarship offers the diametrically opposed on the ground portraits of the struggles, resistance, as well as aspiration of original people and indigenous nations against the state and corporate encroachment in their communities and against their cultures and their existence.
So it seems to me that ONAIL is a dissenting approach to international law, even dissenting from already dissenting approaches, existing approaches, critical approaches such as TWAIL, because as you said, TWAIL, in the end of the day, is still very state-centric, has a problematic terminology, I would say, especially from my point of view, from where I stand here. I'm a Brazilian academic. I'm currently in Brazil, and I remember, for example, in high school, we talking about this kind of nomenclature: the first word, third word, the second word concerning the socialist states, and it seems to me a bit offensive, And how do we allocate the different countries, the different states in these groups? So this is problematic for me. And it seems to me also that you're talking about inequalities within a state as well, because this third world approach, in the end of the day, you're not addressing inequalities. You're not addressing deficit democracy within the state. So you have several nations, possibly several nations within a state. The third world approaches do not address this, and ONAIL aims to address this then.
That's correct. Like if you look at just the United States, the country in which I live, there are about 400 indigenous nations had signed the international treaty with the US government. And all of those treaties had been fully ratified by the US government. But every one of those international treaties had been unilaterally violated by the United States. So if the United States is the legal country, respect the rule of law, then the US government has to respect the treaties they have signed with 400 indigenous nations in North America.
Yeah, and I would say not only North America, therefore, if we fly over to Europe as well, we can see in the recent history of Europe, many European nations, taking already assuming your definition of nation, they are asserting their nationality within states. And we have examples, I would say, in Catalonia, in Bavaria, in Germany, there, Northern Ireland. Can you talk about this as well? What's going on in Europe there concerning this, and how can ONAIL help us to understand what's happening there?
Yeah, that's very good. So ONAIL tried to make a clear distinctions between the original nations that exist outside of Europe, as well as original nations that exist in Europe. Because let me give you some basically background, how this ONAIL distinguishes between original nations that exist outside of the European continent that still largely practice the culture of self-sustaining tradition, as well as the self-governance, ways of life. On the opposite, the European nations do not practice self-sustaining cultural practices, nor they have self-governance system. For example, you mentioned Scotland, Northern Ireland, Catalonia, recently asserted their rights for national independence from their respective system of, let's say, United Kingdom. In the case of Catalonia, Spain. The difference between the struggles of original nation elsewhere and those European nations, there are numerous differences. One striking difference is the fact that these European nations seek their independence without developing or redeveloping their economic, political, social, cultural system, without cultivating or even try to reviving their own system of self-sufficiency and self-governance, which they once practiced before they are being colonized by much bigger powers. That started probably from 800 AD through the emergence of the Holy Roman Empire and the coronation of Charlemagne. Now, we don't have much time to talk about that, but nonetheless, in other words, these original nations in Europe had largely destroyed their own ecological system, and they have already polluted once fertile soil and fresh water, engaged in a massive deforestation and destruction of their own biological and ecological diversities in their national territories. So in order for them to survive, those European nations continue to exploit natural and human resources of other nations elsewhere as exploitable property for their own gain and profit. And one of the unique characteristics of the original and indigenous nation elsewhere has been the preservation of self-sustaining culture, tradition of self-governance, and being reliant on the health of the ecological system and biological diversity upon which the original nation sustained their culture, polity, and economic system. Like Awaswas people here in the Bay Area and Ohlone Nation people, okay, had been self-sufficient while preserving and conserving their own ecological and biological diversity. But the European nations today, and as well as in the past, had actively participated with the state system to exploit, usurp, and destroy other nations and their ancestral homeland. Scotland, for example, a very proud European nation that reside in the British Isle, had created their own colonies in North America. And Irish people are also actively participating in the UK's settler state colonialism in North America through their migration, as well as actively participating in the formation of what I call shock troops of empire. For example, by serving in its infamous 7th Cavalry, called Irish Geese, in exterminating American Indians, including the infamous Wounded Knee Massacre, killing hundreds of elderly Indians, women, and children in 1890. And soon after that, they were sent in the late 19th century to the Philippines to exterminate American Asian Indians in Southeast Asia, killing with other U.S. military troopers in the multiple islands of Philippines to exterminate Asian Indians in Southeast Asia. And their excursion led to the killing of anywhere from 500,000 to 1.2 million Filipinos, making the third largest island of the Philippines, as the historians call howling wilderness, by exterminating every indigenous people over age of 10, including women, men, girls, and children. So in other words, those European nations still dependent upon the state-initiated colonial projections upon the nomenclature I had to use, but the third world countries, and the exploitation of the original nations in those developing countries or in the global south elsewhere.
Okay, yeah, very good. Yes, you tell me now regional nations. It could be even that they are the first world. You know, it's not that they're the third world, you know, they are the first world perhaps. But I keep thinking, for example, how to know more about ONAIL and what criticisms have the ONAIL approaches have received so far?
The first criticism I received was the necessity to create the distinction between, say, original nations in the European continent who had been struggling against the state system, you know, from the Okinawa in Japan to the Karens and Rohingya people in Myanmar and Moro people in the Philippines and other Islamic communities in South Asia, such as in India, and as well as Palestinians and the original nations like Kurdistan in the formerly Ottoman Empire, like today's Turkey, as well as Syria, Iraq, Iran, because Kurdistan had been basically partitioned into 4 different state systems, as well as large, disparate population throughout the world. And try to make a clear distinction between this original nation and their struggles in elsewhere and original nation in Europe. So it was quite important to look at the clear cultural differentiation of the ways in which original nation in Europe, not only Scotland or Northern Ireland or Catalonia, but also the Bavaria, Flanders, Tyrol in, say, Northern Italy, and many other, the emergent nationalism, very strong push for the secession from their respective systems. So one criticism was the necessity to make a clear distinction between the original nation in Europe as well as original nation and still going conflict, the military struggles engaged by resistors of original nation in the non-European continents and regions. And so that was the major criticism. But other than that, I believe that the original nation approach makes sense in a sense that if you think of the more than 90% of the today's conflicts around the globe, which I just mentioned, from East Asia to the Middle East to even Northern Africa, like Burkina Faso and even Mali, those indigenous people try to fight against imperial projections imposed by France and many other former colonial powers, as well as throughout the continent of the Americas. And so it was quite important to look at the struggles of those different original nations, because each country had a different colonial history, and as well as original nations entrapped within those states, they have also a very unique history of their resistance and struggles. So it was very important for me to focus on the unique and particularistic aspects of the history and traditions of the struggles of the original nation in various different parts of the world.
And for our viewers, can they find more information published already? Is there some sort of manifesto of ONAIL? Is there a landmark paper published, a book? How can they find more information about this? Because our time is, of course, very limited for this very comprehensive approach.
Okay. The book, Original Nation Approach to International Law, will come out next year. But if you want to have a quick summary of this approach, it came out in the journal last year, and Indiana Journal of Global Legal Studies. It has a brief summary of this approach and clear distinction of the ONAIL from, say, TOIL, as well as the sketchy differences of original nation approaches taken by European nations, as well as the nations elsewhere. But the book will come out. I'm almost completing the revision. Actually, this week I'm sending the revised manuscript to the publisher, and should be coming out sometime.
2021. Very good, very good. Final question, because also of the time we have. What is the future of ONAIL?
I would like to have the critical debate in studying the original nations and their prescient visions they had from its 1,000 years back, because we live in the age of Anthropocene. We see tremendous climate disasters, not only sea level rising, deforestation. California is becoming desert. If you look at the Haiti, turning desert, and this anthropogenic disasters, those are man-made disasters. And if you look at the original nations, the cultures of self-sustenance or self-governance, they preserved and conserved the what's left of biological and ecological diversities. So I think it's very important to learn from their cultures how they have conserved the ecological diversity and biological diversity throughout their own generations, because that's something like European nations have forgotten. They have polluted their environment. They have eradicated ecological diversity of their own. That's why they have depend on the exploitation of all those original nations, their homeland, ecodiversities in their homeland for their survival. So there should be a critical discussions of the lifestyles, cultures, and traditions, even memories of these original nations, and learn from them how to steward our ways of life on the basis of what we can learn, and based upon whatever the surviving cultures being still preserved by original nations throughout the world.
Very good. Thank you very much, Professor Hiroshi. And with this, I think we can finish here the first inaugural video of our organization, our OPREC, that is the Observatory of Political Rights and Citizenship, which is aimed especially at presenting dissenting approaches, theoretical approaches, dissenting theories, dissenting perspectives, and dissenting in the sense of divergent senses that people already have in their minds, that we want to break with common ideas that already exist. And so I thank you very much for being here. I think the viewers must have liked quite a lot to think about these different perspectives, because sometimes we think democracy, democratic state, but that same state that we can imagine might not be democratically enough inside, within its borders, within the nations that it holds upon its territory. So thank you very much, Professor Hiroshi Fukurai. It was a pleasure, and see you next time.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Thank you for inviting me.